This webinar is going to be delivered by Rachel Morgan Trimmer, who is an excellent trainer. There she is there, with the books in the background. And it's about managing neurodiverse people in the workplace. It's a really interesting subject.
Well, now I'm doing my standard half-hour neurodiversity workshop, which is called What is Neurodiversity and Why Should You Care About It? But if I can today, I am going to try and chuck in some stuff about managing your neurodiverse staff remotely, as I know that this is an issue some of you might have at the moment. And in the chat window, excuse me, towards the end, I will put a link to the slides that I normally use, which are on SlideShare. And I will also put in a link to my LinkedIn article, which is called How to Manage Your Neurodiverse Staff When They're Working Remotely. So you will get a lot more information after this session if you want to look at it further. My actual job is as a coach and as a consultant. So that means I work one-on-one with neurodiverse individuals. Sometimes I work with normal people as well, but I help entrepreneurs and people who are, they might be having a day job and a side hustle, or they might just be career women like most of you, and then I help them to manage their day-to-day lives, work-life balance, and all kinds of stuff like that. Because I have ADHD and autism myself, and I've spent many years trying to manage various aspects of my life and my work, because I've been running my own business for 15 years. So I thought I've developed all these tools, all these ways of doing things, all these worksheets and these planners and schedules, and now I use those to share. As a consultant, I go into workplaces. I do like a full version of the workshop that I'm doing today, and I help people understand neurodiversity and what that means, and not just about the challenges that are faced by neurodiverse people, because a lot of the time it's framed as this massive problem, but also about the strengths that neurodiverse people can bring. But what is neurodiversity? I've gone totally lo-fi here. I've printed out my slides because I can't, because of the, I don't know if it's autism or ADHD or just the fact that I haven't used Zoom a lot, but I can't switch between the screen and the Zoom because I lose you, and I rely a lot on audience feedback. So this is neurodiversity, and I can read that out to you. And again, this is all going to be online. So it's a collection of conditions. The first one, which you're probably most familiar with, is dyslexia, which is challenges with reading and writing and spelling. Then we have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which you probably know better as ADHD. There's autism. Dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is clumsiness, difficulty with large motor movements like riding a bike, and fine motor movements like using a mouse. Then there's dyscalculia, which is difficulty processing numbers and numerical information. And then finally, we have Tourette's. Not everybody includes Tourette's as a neurodiverse condition, but enough people do that I put it on my list. So I'm going to go through the top three in a little bit more detail now. Those are, that's dyslexia, ADHD, and autism. And the reason I'm going through those three are because those are by far the most likely that you're going to be faced with at work, and the ones that you're probably going to have to deal with. So I'll start with dyslexia. I talk a lot about the characteristics of these conditions. And when I do that, not everybody has all the characteristics. And even in someone who has most of them, there are some that are quite strong in some individuals and some that are a lot weaker. So when I talk about characteristics, it is a very general thing, and every person you meet with a neurodiverse can be different. So dyslexia, the universal characteristic with dyslexia is challenges with reading and writing and spelling. Almost all dyslexics are going to find reading easier than writing, and they vary enormously. And there are two reasons for that. Partly it's because it's a very variable condition and there are different types, but also the way dyslexics are taught varies enormously. How early the intervention is there, how good their dyslexia teacher is, and so on. Dyslexia is a funny one because with ADHD and autism, you can kind of muddle through most of the time. You can be really autistic and still sort of function. But with dyslexia, because our world is so built around reading and writing, it's something that has to be dealt with. So a lot of parents and teachers are very committed to helping dyslexics learn to read and write. And some of them do very well with it, and you don't even know that they're dyslexic because you can't tell from their reading and writing. And some, even with interventions, struggle a great deal with reading and writing. Another characteristic of dyslexia is what I call difficulty things order right getting in there. And that's not just in somebody's mind, but in doing something. A lot of us are quite good at sequencing. You get told to do a task and you know the order that you should do those things in. But with some dyslexic people, they can't sequence it. They would have to write it down. And sometimes you'll see a dyslexic person doing something very deliberately when they're having a task that needs sequencing, because they've been taught to sort of, it's almost like building blocks together, and it's a very conscious thing that they're doing. I'm going to show you number 3 on my list. It's this one. Can read words like this more easily. Can you see the middle's muddled up? A dyslexic person can read that sentence more easily than you and me, because that's how they read normally. They see the beginning of the word, and the middle doesn't really matter much to them. So when the middle of the word is muddled up or misspelled, they can actually read that more easily than most people. Dyslexics tend to be very creative. They're very spatial and they're very insightful. You see a lot of dyslexics in graphic design and in architecture, and anything that involves patterns or shapes or spaces, and 3D modeling they're really good at as well. I can't picture things in 3D very well in my head, but a dyslexic can see all that straight away without having to concentrate very hard. And I've noticed recently, you know, with everything's been happening, I've been working in a group with other neurodiverse people. We've called ourselves Neurodiverse COVID-19 Rescue Squad, and we're using our skills to help people in difficult situations. And one of the things I've noticed from the dyslexics, I'll say, oh, this person has a problem, and they can solve it like that. They can just see the link straight away between the problem and the solution. And it always makes me feel like an idiot, because I think that's so obvious. Why didn't I think of that? And a dyslexic can just do that straight away. So they're brilliant for that. They can extrapolate from incomplete data as well, because of that ability to see the big picture. They can see where something will fit in. They can see those patterns. They can find gaps in those patterns and fill them in. And again, that's brilliant for problem solving. One of the things I put on my slides is that dyslexics are loaded. They're not all loaded, but I think it's really interesting that 40% of self-made UK millionaires are dyslexic, and 25% of British CEOs are also dyslexic, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But if you're thinking about having a dyslexic as your next partner, I have a word of warning for you. They won't text you back. The first is that it might be very easy for you to send a text or send an email or put something in the chat window here. You might just be able to bash it out without really thinking about it, and it might be very quick. But for a dyslexic, it can take quite a long time, and they don't always have time to reply to your text, you know, because it takes them that much longer. And the other reason is that they're quite often embarrassed if they know their spelling isn't very good, or the way they put words together isn't very good, or they use the wrong word. And so sometimes they tend to avoid texting or emailing back because of that embarrassment, and they might be afraid that you're judging them as well. And that's something that's important in remote working, because now everybody's working from home. Some dyslexic people are now having to do more written work than they used to. You know, Slack, people are on Slack a lot, and things like this. Zoom is good for dyslexics because they're talking. And but the thing is, with the chat, they can't. I just read what Sally read straight away while I'm talking to you. A dyslexic person can't do that, and they won't be able to read it. So you might find that you need to give a dyslexic person more opportunities for information, or you might need to offer them even special software. So screen reading software can be really good, so they don't have to read it, they can listen to it. And one of the issues with that is that you don't want to you don't want to single people out, do you? Especially, you know, some people are fine with being dyslexic and open about it, but not everybody is. So one thing I suggest is that you offer that accommodation to everybody. So now everybody's working at home. If you can, you say, does everybody can have screen reading software if they want. And someone who can read will say, no, I don't need that. But a dyslexic could take you up on it. So that's one of the key elements to managing the staff remotely, is any adaptations that you think might be needed, you offer those to everybody. So that's dyslexic. Sally's asked me, how do we meet the ego if people are single? That's a very good question, Sally. I think it's time for some online networking, maybe some Zoom meetings with some CEOs.
Because they're all
So our
millionaires.
next one.
Well, some are.
Yeah, yes. My next one is ADHD, and I've got really poor impulse control because of my ADHD. I've got some sweets on my desk here. I do this little game when I do the this workshop in real life, and I ask people to put my sweets in a jar so I don't eat them all. So I give one person, do you like bon maman? I love bon maman jars, don't you? Mm. This has been a reused one. So I give one person very few sweets, and I give them a lovely big bon maman jar to put them in. And they do it quickly because I make it a game. Who can do it first? So that person wins. That is a normal person with few sweets and a big jar. And then the second person has loads of sweets. This is a spice jar. They have loads of sweets and they have a tiny jar. So it takes them a while to stuff all those sweets into this little jar. But that's not the ADHD one. That's just someone who's got a lot on and not a lot of space or not a lot of time. And I think I'm seeing a lot of women on this call, and I know some are going to be working parents and things. And I think it's something that affects working mothers more than a lot of other groups. You get how, you've got a lot to do and not necessarily a lot of time, or maybe not a lot of energy. But that's not the ADHD one. This is. Can you see my sweets? The ADHD person doesn't even have a jar. So I give them the sweets, I pretend that there's going to be a jar, and they open it up and they just sit there going, I don't know what to do. You've told me to put the sweets in a jar and I can't do it. And that's what having ADHD feels like. We're constantly asked to do things, and other people, they might have a big jar and can do it really easily, or they might have a small jar and a lot of sweets, but they can still do it. And they literally don't have the tools to do the things that are asked of us. And I think that's a really important thing with ADHD, because so many times we're expected to just do things that other people can, and we literally can't do it. So I'm going to show you my ADHD slide. Do you know what? At my last workshop, someone took a photo of this, and I thought, I hope whoever sees that on Twitter doesn't think all my slides are like this, because it's supposed to demonstrate what it's like having an ADHD brain. But not all my slides are like that. But in another talk I do, I don't know if you've seen the David Bowie film where he has all the TVs behind him. Do you know, is it The Man Who Fell to... I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with David Bowie. I just took this picture off the internet. He's sitting in front of like a big bank of TVs, and they're all on, and they're all tuned to a different station. And that's another way of describing ADHD. You've got all these TVs on, and one is what you're supposed to be listening to. Another one is asking you how old David Hasselhoff is. Another one is playing jazz, and then another one is listing all your failures from the past 8 years. So that's why it's so hard to concentrate with ADHD, because you've got all this stuff going on. So some of the characteristics, you probably know, that being forgetful, easily distracted. You could say, I'm looking out the window quite a lot while I'm talking to you. It's not because I'm not concentrating on this. It actually helps me to concentrate if I can look around while I talk, because it's almost like it's soaking up the extra energy. And I'm also looking at my notes on the table here. So forgetful, I already said that, but obviously forgetful people, we say the same thing twice. People with ADHD, like dyslexics, tend to be very creative. And that's two reasons for that. The first is that if we've got a boring task ahead of us, then we will find the quickest and easiest and least painful way of getting that task done. So we're really good at problem solving. And the other reason is that we have a lot of ideas going all the time. All those TVs that I described, everything going on at once. Good ideas are coming through those, as well as all the other nonsense. So that's why we're creative, because we have that, our brains work quite quickly, and we have those ideas coming a lot. We're inconsistent, we can hyperfocus. So it's very hard for me, if I'm in the audience at one of these webinars, to focus sometimes. But if the subject is something I'm really into, then I can focus for the entire time. So Sally mentioned we were at one in real life a few weeks ago, where Sally was speaking, and I could focus on that the entire time because I was so interested in what she was saying and the subject matter and all of that. And a lot of people don't realise that that's the thing that for people with ADHD, if we're into the subject, we can focus for really quite a long time, and we actually get angry if people interrupt that focus. We can multitask, obviously. I'm multitasking right now. And we're good under pressure. Lots of people with ADHD love glitter. You can see some of the things behind me. There's lots of colour there. There's some robots you can see. But you can also see some level of organisation as well. Some people with ADHD, because our brains are a bit of a mess, when we need to, we can actually organise ourselves. So we have we have both of these things going on. We have the bright stuff, we have the glitter, we have the mess, but we also have the organised stuff. And we often have quite minimalist things as well, because our brains and our world is so bright and messy that sometimes minimalism can be what we need in order to concentrate. And I have a client who I sent her all my worksheets, which they were so pretty. They were nicely color coded and they had all these fonts and they had nice borders, and I spent ages on them. And I sent them to her and she said, I hate them. She said, I hate them because they're too busy, they're too pretty. I can't work with them because there's too much going on. So I had to redo them all in just plain black and white, very, very simple with very plain fonts. So that's an example of how two people with ADHD can work with something completely differently at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And then, yeah, we're good under pressure. And did I say that already? Again, forgetful. We're good under pressure and we have difficulty finishing things. Now, the next one I'm coming on to is autism. And I normally use a metaphor of a script with autism, which I'm not doing now because we're all separate and we can't really put on a play when we're all in different locations. But having autism is like being in a play and everyone else has a script and everyone else knows what they're doing except you. And it's not just about what to say, like you have in the script, it's your cue as well. Knowing when it's your turn to speak, knowing when to move, knowing what tone of voice it is. So that's really hard for autistic people. And I talk quite a lot in my workshops about the spectrum. You've all heard of the spectrum, the autistic spectrum?
Maybe just remind us.
Yeah, well, it didn't print out properly, but on the normal, what people think obviously to autistic spectrum is a line, just a line going from normal to a bit autistic in the middle, and then Rain Man at the other end. And that's not what autism is like at all. A spectrum is like a colour spectrum, so it's like a rainbow. So you've got all the colours in it, and you have different things in different places. But also, you notice on a colour spectrum, you don't have fixed lines. You don't have, you're good at this, and then you stop, and then you have a different characteristic. Everything is a bit more nuanced than that, and it flows into each other. There's loads of things on the autistic spectrum, so I'm just going to talk about a few of them in this session because we don't have loads of time. So one of the things that people talk about is that autistic people are boring. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that we do tend to get obsessed by things and we tend to bang on about those obsessions long after everybody else has lost interest. And the second reason is that autistic people do tend to talk in a monotone. We do tend to talk in a flat voice. And I'm actually having voice training now. I have she's actually a singing teacher who's looking for a new direction, and we have our lessons online now. And she's helping me to learn to vary the pitch of my voice a bit more so I can be a bit more engaging to the people I speak to, because it's not a natural thing for me. This is my public speaking voice that I'm using now, but in normal conversation I can sound quite flat. Intractable is one of the characteristics of autism. We can be quite inflexible. We know there's a proper way of doing things, and we don't like it if other people aren't doing that thing properly, what we think of being as proper. We're rubbish at social stuff. As I sort of explained with that script example, we don't know when it's our turn to speak. We can say the wrong thing. That happens quite a lot. And some autistics are very quiet because we don't know when it's our turn to speak. And some of us, particularly women, I think, have kind of been told to shut up because we don't know the right thing to say. So we tend to retreat and not say anything because we're getting mocked or told off for it. Insensitive is a very common accusation leveled at autistics, and it's true, we can be insensitive, but the thing is we don't mean to be insensitive. We don't mean to be blunt, and we don't mean to be unkind. It's just that we don't really have that filter that everybody else does. You know, when you think something and then something in your brain says you shouldn't say that out loud. An autistic person doesn't have that, and we come out with sometimes really quite rude stuff, and it's not meant to be rude, it's just honest. And then obsessive is another one. You know, I talked about those obsessive interests that a lot of people have. They have autism. I've got my pet theory about this, actually, about why women are underdiagnosed with autism. And I think one reason is that women's interests are not seen as a problem. So when you've got a male autistic, you might have him tinkering with cars. I know an autistic who's big into cars, or craft beers, or collecting transformers, or the proper classic is train spotting, isn't it? An autistic man in his anorak doing the train spotting. But stereotypical women's interests, things like cooking. My personal autistic interest is cooking. And I thought to myself, when I was wondering if I was autistic, I was looking at the list of characteristics and it said obsessive interest. And I said, I'm not obsessed with anything. And then I thought, I've got 150 cookbooks, which is more than most people have. But no one ever says to me, could you stop baking me tasty cakes, please? Can you stop making dinner? Can you stop being interested in food? Can you stop, you know, shopping for food and cooking healthy things? So it's not seen as a problem. And another stereotypical autistic female interest is craft. And no one says too much knitting is a thing. They don't say you're knitting too much, do they? Or you've got to stop making stuff for the special care baby unit. That's not a thing. So my pet theory is that women's interests are not seen as a problem because they're productive. They do things for other people. And that's one reason that a lot of female autistics go undiagnosed. So that's my obsession, actually, my pet autistic theory. And then the final characteristic I want to talk about with autism is that we are weird. And that is, you know, I get called weird a lot. And it is true, autistic people can be weird. They talk in a weird way, you know, they have weird interests, and that's something that's quite common. But everything that I've just talked about, those 6 characteristics, each of them has an opposite. So the first one I mentioned was boring, but boring can also equal methodical. So if you need somebody to do your tax return or to sort all your stuff out for you, an autistic person will not only do it for you, they will actually enjoy it. So that's one benefit. Intractable was the second thing I mentioned. And it sounds counterintuitive, but an intractable individual can be a really good problem solver. You know, when you go in somewhere and you're trying to get something done and they say, computer says no. You remember that? Was it from Little Britain or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, computer says no. And lots of people will say that their approach will be good to go, oh, okay, and just stop or try and get to the supervisor or not do the thing. But an autistic person will try and go around the problem sideways. So say, well, if the computer says no, can we take the computer away? Is there a way of making it say something else? And I see a lot of autistic people, in fact, someone said they actually rip the problem apart and then put it back together because the logical mind is able to do that. So again, good at problem solving. You know, that's something that we have in common with people with ADHD and dyslexia, actually, being good at problem solving. I said we are rubbish at social stuff, and it means that we can be quite honest. Autistic people actually make quite good friends because we're not manipulative. We don't really know what drives other people. So it means that we can't manipulate them. So yeah, we do tend to be quite honest, and that overlaps a little bit with what I was saying about being insensitive. The flip side of somebody being insensitive is that they're clear. We're not very good at nuance. We're not very good with euphemisms. So if you ask us a question, we will give you a clear answer. And I've worked with like groups of autistics when I've needed something, and I've got to tell you, it saves so much time when you're just given clear information that you need without any extra words, without people tiptoeing around or any of that. And it just makes our lives so much easier. So the flip of being obsessive is that we do have really good attention to detail, and I know in the law that is that's a really good quality. You know, when you need people to look at those contracts and make sure there's nothing wrong in them or nothing that's going to go pear-shaped, that's a great quality. And the last thing I said was that autistic people can be weird, but the other side of that is that we tend to be non-judgmental because we spent so long being told that we're weird, that we're actually quite understanding of other people's quirks, and we're quite open-minded as to, you know, what other people can bring. And I think that's a really nice thing about autistic people, being non-judgmental. So I'd like you to have a think now. If you think the neurodiverse conditions that I've talked about today, if they are a difference or a disability or a strength or a weakness. So most people say, yeah, I think they're a difference. Yeah, I think we can all agree they're a difference. when I ask if they're, in fact, can you give me a show of hands, who thinks they're a disability? I've got no hands up. I always get at least one person putting their hand up with the...
My daughter is dyslexic, and when she was discovered to be dyslexic at 17, she then got help with more time because they said she had a reading age of a 12-year-old. So she got more time for her A-levels, and this had been the reason she didn't get the grade she was always expected to get, because she ran out of time when she was doing exams. She had to keep reading it again and again. So this was finally discovered at sixth form college. But however, she went on to get a degree, a 2-1, a second degree in employment law, and then a professional qualification, and has a senior post with Google now. So is it a disability? You know, you can work around, there's ways around it, isn't there? If you believe you can work around it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I often say, yes, it is a disability, because in the law, it's helpful if you class it as such. So then, you know, I spend a lot of time advising companies not to get rid of people with neurodiverse conditions because it's managing them. So, but if I go and use the Equality Act, saying it's a disability, you know, it can be a way forward. But actually, it's a strength. I'm probably second guessing, I don't know what the other questions are, that in the law, we often dismiss people, or I get calls all the time, senior CEOs under the public access scheme, asking how they can get rid of people for various reasons. When you drill down to it, it's because they say it's competence, when really it's not. They've got people in the workforce who've got neurodiverse conditions, often undiagnosed, because people want a job, they don't want to disclose it. And we encourage people to come to work as their full selves, but then we judge them on their hair and, you know, and their, you know, behavior in the workplace. And so that then results in employers treating those as competency issues when they're not. So I would say that they can be disabilities because they're useful for the law to class them as such, because then people have got rights. But really, as I get older, I see them as strengths more than anything.
I think I really love this question when I do it in a workshop, because everyone they sort of hover and they go, am I allowed to choose more than one? And is it a real disability? And with the lawyers always answer differently because of the Employment, is it the Employment Act?
Yeah, it's the Equality Act.
Yeah, so I find that really interesting, because some people will say, yeah, it's definitely a disability. And then I say, do you think I'm disabled? And they always say no, which I think is really interesting. And, you know, it depends on whether you define yourself as disabled or not as well. So there wasn't a right answer to that. I was just soliciting your opinion, because I think it's a really interesting way of, you know, do we look at it as a disability or not, or just a difference, or do we look at it as a strength or a weakness? And I think the answer is probably a mix of all of those things. So just to wrap up now, I'd like to ask you why you should care about neurodiversity. And this brings me to my favourite slide, so I'm going to hold up. Let's look at that. Thank you. A lot of people come to inclusion about neurodiversity from a fluffy point of view. They want to do the right thing, they want to be inclusive, they want to be fluffy like the kitten. And some people come at it from that angle, which is cold hard cash. And I think they're both valid, because obviously you need to care about the economics, you need to care about profitability and productivity. Otherwise you don't have a business and then nobody has a job. So they're both important. So the first reason, I'm just going to take a steps to the side, because Trish is asking me, is OCD another?
Yeah. Is it another characteristic?
Of which condition?
Well, I was thinking of dyslexia, because I know that my daughter has OCD as well. Everything has to be in a certain order. And is that a characteristic of the dyslexia, or is it just her?
It's not. That's a really interesting question, actually. So I'm going to sidestep now to answer that. Neurodiverse conditions are conditions that say the same all the time. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a mental illness, and that means it can go up and down and it can get better. Neurodiversity conditions don't get better. You get better at managing them, and some people think they get better just because we cope with the symptoms better, especially as you get older. But that's the key difference. But what's really interesting is that half of people with ADHD and autism also suffer from depression or anxiety, or both. I'm not sure what the rates are for dyslexia, but there's a big correlation between mental illness and neurodiversity. And obsessive compulsive disorder is a comorbid condition with normally with one of those two, and that means you normally start off with depression or anxiety, and then when you get a condition like OCD or an eating disorder or an addiction or something else, that's manifesting as an unhealthy coping mechanism to cope with your depression or anxiety. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because Lizzie did suffer anxiety when she first took a big role on, but she got help for it by the way of counselling, and it made a massive difference. Yeah.
I'm really pleased to hear that. Yeah. So, oh yeah, Kate said obsessive compulsive disorder is generally part of the family of anxiety disorders, but being a neuroatypical person, that's being a neurodiverse person, can often go hand in hand with anxiety, especially if not supported properly. That's a really good point. Thank you for that, Kate. So going back to some of the benefits of hiring neurodiverse staff, we are 30 to 50% more productive, which is a lot. And I can source, if you're interested, I don't have the sources right to hand. I think one of them is from a study by JP Morgan Chase, that we are more productive because we learn faster. And there was actually a case at Microsoft where they had an autistic hiring program, and the autistic people learned stuff in 6 months that was taking the neurotypical people 3 years to learn. So there's not loads of data on neurodiversity in the workplace at the moment, but all the data that we do have is pointing towards the same thing, which is that we learn faster and that we're more productive. And I think some of those characteristics that I went over earlier can show you why, you know, how quickly we learn, that problem solving, and so on. And then inclusive workplaces have lower staff absence. Now with that, that study came out of Deloitte, and it actually refers to all kinds of inclusivity, not just neurodiverse inclusivity, but I thought it was really interesting, so I wanted to include it. So the staff absence rate in a neurodiverse workplace equates to 1 day per person per year, which doesn't sound a lot, but if you've got 1,000 people working for you, that's 1,000 days a year, so it does add up. I know some people worry that making adaptations for neurodiverse people are going to cost a lot of money. I mentioned screen readers as one example. And then, but it's really interesting that 59% of adaptations for neurodiverse people cost absolutely nothing at all. It's just, you know, it can be something like communication, or it can just be a chat, or there's so many things that you can do to make the workplace more inclusive. So I think that's really interesting that nearly 2/3 of the adaptations cost absolutely nothing. And then universal accommodations benefit everybody. I love this one because it's the idea that you make the change for that individual, but they can benefit everybody. There was a study at a university in America where they put subtitles on the lectures, and that was only for the students who are hard of hearing, which made up about 3% of the student body. But it turned out that 98% of the students found those subtitles helpful. So you've got this 3% where who it was done for, and then you've got 98% people benefiting. So I think that's a really good example of how adaptations you make for a very small group of people can actually benefit almost everybody. And then I just want to go over a couple of the fluffy, I mean, that was the sort of hard-nosed stuff, you know, the productivity stuff that I just went over. But on the fluffy side, 80% of neurodiverse people are unemployed. So if you give a neurodiverse person a job, if you're inclusive to neurodiverse people and make your place accessible, then you are part of solving that problem of 80% of neurodiverse people being unemployed. I should point out, not every neurodiverse person can work, because, you know, some autistics, for example, also have learning difficulties, or they're severely autistic enough they can't actually have a job, but they are very much the minority, and most people who are neurodiverse do actually want to work. Of course, being inclusive is the right thing to do. I'm going to wrap up there, because I think we've got some questions coming in, but just in conclusion, I'd like to say that the biggest thing when it comes to neurodiverse inclusion is your attitude, is having that attitude of going, yeah, this isn't a problem, this isn't, you know, a big expensive difficult thing to manage. It's actually going to bring us benefits. So you've all got that right attitude because you've come to this webinar today. So I'd like to say thank you very much for that.
So good and so useful. I think we're going to need to have you back at some point. I think we'll all agree it was really insightful. to have it mixed also with your personal experiences as well, which made it even better. So thank you very much for joining.